News presents the ATXpansion on Politics 2012, the place where area growth and politics meet.
ATXpansion on Politics 2012 Town Hall. This is a conversation about the issues you'll be facing this election season.
And earlier we mentioned that nonpartisan Texas Lyceum poll. It found out that education was one of the top concerns for Texas voters this year. Many of us recall the protest at the state capitol over the school funding cuts made during the last session of the legislature. That led to layoffs and program cuts in many districts. The Lyceum poll asked voters whether they would back paying higher taxes for education. 61% said they would pay more to build new schools. 67% supported higher taxes to bring better technology to public schools. And nearly 3 out of 4 Texans polled said they would pay higher taxes to raise teacher pay.
So this one gets down to the really local level, but how does education affect this election? Anyone who wants to jump in first?
Well, I don't know that it affects this specific November election, but I think it will affect the next legislative session. I'm involved with, as a conservative, with a broad coalition to get away from this excessive teaching to the test and this kind of one-size-fits-all education policy we have in Texas, which emphasizes or pushes this pressure on everybody going to a 4-year university. I think you need multiple pathways. We have a shortage of skilled workers in our state and a real denigration and a de-emphasis on what we used to call vocational education, but now is called career and technical education for secondary school students. So a lot of students are dropping out. You've got to have multiple pathways rather than this sort of $450 million plus testing system, and that's not good for the students, whether they're career-oriented or college-oriented. There's too much teaching to the test, test learning versus real learning. So I think there's an interesting coalition shaping up. I don't see an impact in terms of the November election because there's support for this concept of multiple pathways across the board, but I see it as a major issue in the next legislative session.
No, I think the reason that this isn't a big issue in this election is what Ross said. There are 12 seats in play. Right. We could tell everyone in those 12 districts what's going on, and that leaves more than, 130 some that have no idea. If you're watching KXAN and you're in Austin, you know that the legislature cut education by about $5.4 billion. If you're not here in Austin and aren't irritated by the protests, then you really aren't aware. And Tom brings up an excellent point. Most people in Texas have no idea that when the legislature was cutting $5 billion from schools, they were also giving $500,000 to Pearson Education for these new tests when we didn't have it. And the consequence was that, I send my kids to more crowded classrooms this year, even here in Austin. And they're good schools, but parents notice the crowded classrooms. They don't know what the cause is yet. And I agree with Tom. That's going to be a big issue in the legislature, not an issue in the elections.
Okay. Regina, a 4-year education maybe not be for everyone. Vocational schools are certainly an option for a lot of people. I know, just for an instance, I read that there's going to be a huge shortage of auto mechanics in the coming years. We need people in those kind of jobs.
That's true. Of course, I do work at an institute of higher education, so of course I believe in the value of that as well. I do think it's interesting to consider going kind of back to the national level. One of the issues that young people in particular are very concerned about is not just the economy and what their job prospects will be, but also things like funding for higher education. So trying to tie everything together here, you had asked a moment ago, why are voting rates low in Texas? We don't know enough about the answer to that, but what we do know is that Texas ranks 5th in terms of the size of our young potential voting population, people aged 18 to 29. And we know that among those people in general, education is a huge concern for them, obviously. Some of them for their children, some of them, many of them for themselves.
All right, thank you. We want to talk about health care. We've already talked about it a little bit, but there is a lot of talk about health care this season.
The Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, is still causing a lot of debate around the country. The Texas Lyceum poll found that 45% of registered voters had a favorable opinion of the federal health care law. 46% do not like that law. One key provision of the law would allow Texas to expand Medicaid access, with the federal government covering most of the costs.
The question is, should Texas opt into that program? 49% of voters in the poll said yes to expanding the health care coverage. 40% said that the state should not pay more into Medicaid because it's a broken program.
Of course, there's a huge divide over health care policy. What direction lawmakers are likely to take, Ross?
If you scratch this thing, if you scratch that poll, the answers to those questions were all the Republicans were over here and all the Democrats were over there. So when you enter this thing, the federal government has said if you expand Medicaid, Texas is eligible for about $100 billion over 10 years. And Texas would like to figure out a way to take that money, but there are some strings attached. The governor has said he doesn't want to take money with strings attached. He would rather do block grants. And really, when you go into the legislative session in January, those are the two sides of the beginning of the negotiation. And I think they'll probably figure something out, because the state really wants the money and the federal government really wants Texas in. About 25% of the state here is uninsured. It's a huge part of the national uninsured population, and to make a national health care plan work, they have to have Texas.
Well, I think this is a real national debate in the presidential race, and quite frankly, I don't care whether you're the governor of who's a Republican in a Republican state or a Democratic governor in a predominantly Democratic state. The way Medicaid is going is going to bankrupt all the states. You talk about we need more money for education. If Medicaid keeps going up in terms of its cost, money's just not going to be there for the other necessary services. I think that Governor Romney is right in making the case that we need to block grant back Medicaid like we did welfare reform in the Reagan administration. Block grant it back to the states, send the money as well, and provide the laboratories at the local and state level to make the determination how to provide that safety net for people that can't afford health care. I think this centralization of power in health care and in Medicaid is the wrong